Unique concepts in gaming rarely seem to come around. Exploring history through an interactive medium is nothing new. Even injecting a revisionist history of events is old hat at this point. So what lies at the core of Assassin's Creed that makes it worth experiencing? For me, it was a strong narrative focus. History was not only the backdrop of your playground, it provided stories and eras for exciting gameplay and immersive experiences. You can pretty much do a virtual tour of some of history's greatest moments by switching from one game to the other. Eras like the Golden Age of piracy in the Caribbean, the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, the Viking invasion of England, the final days of the Pharaohs, and Victorian London. You can participate in historical events like the Battle of Bunker Hill, the storming of the Bastille, or the assassination of Julius Caesar. Historical figures like George Washington, Leonardo da Vinci, Marquis de Sade, Frederick Abeline, Richard the Lionheart, and Socrates would work alongside you to fight rivals like Charles Lee, Rodrigo Borgia, Germain, Jack the Ripper, Robert de Sable, and Pericles. Each of the games used the surrounding history to its advantage in crafting stories around a fictional rivalry between the Assassins and Templars that would form the backbone of many pivotal moments in Earth's story. Oh, and there are some modern-day stories that not all of us really like. Like all franchises, not all of the games are created equal. Which game spoke the most to me? Which are overhated, overrated, or overlooked? I'll be ranking the mainline games, thus we'll be excluding mobile and handheld games and Assassin's Creed Chronicles, principally because I've not played them, and from what I've heard, none of them really measure up to the mainline games anyways. So, let's swan dive into the list, shall we? I'm actually kind of impressed how much this game looks and feels like one of the big sibling games. There are also some great elements here, like the character of Aveline de Grandpré, the personas, and the idea of some sequences being experienced multiple times through different viewpoints. However, the story is hard to follow at times. The stakes feel very low, and the setting feels more like wallpaper to the events happening rather than being an integral part of the story. And yet the technical improvements could still never convince me that it was originally released or meant for consoles. It's an okay Assassin's Creed experience if you have no other recourse, but any of the other games are more worth seeking out. I kind of throw my hands up in the air because I don't think I will ever share the love for this game. It's not so much that the game is just glorified DLC for the previous game, it's that I'm not really sure I buy the story. Playing as a Templar is an obvious, but good idea for one of these games. Rogue squanders the opportunity to truly have us understand the Templar motivations, sympathize with them, and create an intelligent argument between the groups. Shay seems to join the Templars more because they aren't bloodthirsty maniacs causing earthquakes accidentally, rather than coming to realize the Templars actually have a better view on how to solve the world's problems. That seems fairly shallow to me, especially as a catalyst for a character who's described in-game as a lifelong convert to the Templar cause. It seems like specifically Achilles' leadership is the problem. So why doesn't Shay just initiate a takeover, form a splinter group, or just sit down and talk with Achilles about his actions? He acts entirely on his emotions, and never seems to understand that Achilles is just acting to stay ahead of the Templars without thinking, and that Achilles' mentality isn't representative of the Assassin's Creed. What's worse is that the Templars are portrayed very similarly to the Assassin's allies from previous games. They don't seem to operate or behave much differently than the assassins we've come to know, so it just feels like we switched the white and the black hats for this outing. I also have issues with Achilles' characterization and the lack of meaningful side quests. I also think the French and Indian War is a poor backdrop for an abbreviated game like this. The game barely uses this conflict in its story, and it feels like it is there because the game serves as a historical prequel to Assassin's Creed 3. The 7 Years' War was an important step in the progression towards the American Revolution, and so it feels thematically appropriate to compare to Shay's story, but the game never takes the time to make us ponder this larger idea. Now, I do like the refinement of the seafaring combat from Black Flag. The Arctic Ocean is a real visual treat and feels distinct from the Caribbean, and I do like that the game isn't overly padded. However, these are the window dressings for a story that really feels like an afterthought, and thus kills a lot of my enjoyment of the game. The Seduction of Cleopatra by Julius Caesar is a provocative idea to base an Assassin's Creed game around. Tying that into the formal origins of the Assassins makes it a pretty important point in the ongoing story. Add to that the revamping of the gameplay formula that the series has held on to since 2009 further cements this as a potential highlight of the series. The results for me, obviously by its placing on this list, mixed. Egypt is expansive and beautiful to look at, but there are large stretches that feel empty of meaningful content, and what side missions there are never really grab me. Bayek also feels pretty bland to me, and it's clear that Aya is the more interesting of the two characters. I wish the developers would have just made her the lead character like the original plan they had. I could kind of forgive all of that, but the biggest sin is that the main quest feels too unfocused before coming into the third act. And yet, that third act is almost worth the price of admission. It features some of the best scenes in the series. If you look at this in mathematical terms, it means there are about 4 or so hours of wonderful story amongst the 20 or so other hours of unfocused story. Plus, the introduction to the new style of gameplay comes off as a bit clunky to me, and the game overall seems to be moving away from the identity of the series, in place of essentially trying to compete with other large 3D open-world RPG games like Skyrim or The Witcher 3. It's still worth a playthrough, but it's one that very quickly I remember why the game never quite hit the sweet spot for me. The DLC is absolutely worth checking out though. The first game in the series has one of the most unique settings, and in many ways represents the purest version of Assassin's Creed. I see it as a bit like the most basic sandwich or vanilla ice cream cone. It does the job okay, and most everyone can appreciate it as a foundation for what was to come, but then again, most everyone prefers something a little more complex. I love how close to historical events this one plays, how immersive the setting feels, and even that the maps are taken from period-accurate renderings of the cities. However, the technical problems do persist like a fog over the experience. The slow pace can be a turnoff, and the vagueness of the modern-day sections feel a bit too jarring of a contrast from the focus that the historical segments have. Altair also has a fairly bland vocal performance, especially in comparison to the wonderfully colorful villains and allies, and the score isn't terribly engaging, though it's wonderfully atmospheric. It's not the easiest game to go back to, but like I said, it'll scratch the itch just fine. This is another entry where the influence of modern open-world RPGs feels prevalent. It gets off to a good start. The opening hours feel pretty good. I like a lot of the individual stories in the regions, and I appreciate the simplification of the mission rewards. It makes it very clear what sort of reward you will get with each side mission, and thus helps the player know where they should spend their time. England and Norway are gorgeous areas to explore, and the sync point music in Norway gives me chills every time. The biggest problems I have with this game are related to its story length and the vast amount of content. It feels very bloated, and thus discourages me from running through the story again. And I was never actually sure I was done with the main quest, so I could dabble in the side stuff to my heart's content. I played over 80 to 90 hours before I had gotten to the modern day story finale, and much of the stories in the regions don't tie well into Eivor's emotional journey. Thus, it feels like you're primarily just wandering around England until the story is ready to move on. I don't like that feeling that I have to prove myself to the game for hours on end before I can get to the next chunk of story. Plus, the portrayal and use of Norse mythology never really grabbed me, and it feels like Ubisoft would rather make games around those crazy stories with the insane visuals than Assassin's Creed games with relatively more grounded stories. If so, put Assassin's Creed on ice for 4 to 5 years, go get those games out of your system, and then come back to the series. I hope the next game after this takes a big step back on its length and has a tighter focus on story and character. I feel really bad for this game. It suffered greatly from too little change over too many entries, a myriad of technical issues, and the absolutely bizarre choice for British accents in a game set in the French Revolution and made by a French developer, no less. If you can't get past those issues, I completely understand. If you can, you'll find a surprisingly solid game here. I love Arno and Elise's relationship and how both come to terms with the sides they decide to embrace. It feels like a far more nuanced examination of the Templars and Assassins than Rogue. The missions feel well designed and perhaps have more life to them than any game since Assassin's Creed 2. The writing is solid, and once again, Paris feels like an amazing playground for your exploits. You can't really shake off the fact that Arno feels like a deliberate return to Ezio's personality, so much so that he feels like Ezio 2.0, but he is more of a lively protagonist than some of his predecessors. I also appreciate the idea of co-op missions, even if most of them really aren't worth doing. The new combat style is a bit clunky, as is the stealth system, and the story doesn't truly use the French Revolution to its full extent. I do feel like the game gets more of a bad reputation than it deserves, mostly because I get the feeling that a lot of people haven't come back to it since 2014. However, this is one of the games I am most likely to put in and play through when I feel like I need an Assassin's Creed fix. I used to really dislike this game. Connor is one of the weakest protagonists, and the story's opening acts are a chore to get through. Once the game opens up, it gets significantly better. The American Revolution is an inspired choice to set a game in, and I feel like the game makes the most of the era, even if you don't get to do much in the actual war itself. There's a maturity to the writing that I greatly appreciate, and there are some moments that leave me ponderous. The post-death scenes are the best in the series, especially Thomas Hickey's chasing butterfly speech, and Haytham Kenway is one of the best anti-heroes in the series. The story's a bit too long, the ending with Desmond won't satisfy most people, and some of the areas feel bland design-wise. But the game is home to some of the best narrative moments of the series, and shows signs of a better game that is struggling to get out. Poignant and moving, this is one of the best historical stories of the series. The final days of a life well lived, and yet a man still yearns to know what it all was for. That's such a rich source for a powerful story. The final scenes especially do a great job at bringing these themes home to the audience. The supporting characters also do a great job at complementing Ezio's journey as well, especially Sophia and Yusuf. The villains are a weak point, especially in comparison to the previous games. Altair doesn't get as much focus as I would like, and Desmond's parts feel a bit inconsequential. Both Desmond and Altair have interesting stories to tell, but the game feels the least important in building towards the finale of Desmond's story. The score is also fantastic, and one of the highlights of the series. There are attempts to broaden the gameplay variety that don't ultimately work for me. The tower defense bits are often cited as a major criticism of the game, and while they play fine to me, I don't understand how they were intended to be a fun addition. I love the idea of mentor-apprentice missions and the increased context for the Assassin Conquest minigame, though I do hate that you have to keep a beat on it at all times. I also think the bombs mechanic is a neat idea, but it requires too much active forethought before your missions to be worth the effort. Despite these issues, this is a well-crafted experience for the most part, and with the improved story focus, I have a real soft spot for this one. Syndicate is this high on the list because of its polished gameplay and its sense of fun. It's the game where I feel like the side content ties into the main objectives the best. Apart from collectibles, pretty much everything you're doing is in support of your main objective of eroding Starrick's influence over London. I also feel like these are the best assassination missions of the series, and I love the option of switching between two protagonists that have some different skills. Evie does get the short end of the stick in terms of quantity of missions, but I like her portions better. There are some odd elements I can point to that feel incongruous with the story's focus or are poorly handled, like the relationship between Henry Green and Evie, the World War I material, and some of the sibling rivalry. These are things that take away from a game that has its hopes in trimming down a lot of the fat and making things relevant. The score is also very unique and helps to build a strong identity for the game. Syndicate often gets overlooked because it came after the disastrous launch of Unity and the oversaturation of the series. In a vacuum, I feel this is a refreshing game to return to, especially after the series has gone on to a new style and focus. For many fans, Ezio remains the best protagonist that the series ever had. I tend to agree with this statement, and I think you would only need this game to see why. His story feels like the textbook example of how to build a relatable character in a video game. The downside is that too many of the succeeding entries tended to use a similar template or similar personality in order to build their own characters and stories. Seriously, how many protagonists must be motivated by the death of a family member? The side characters are also the best in the series, and they all feel unique in their roles of helping to train Ezio. The mission variety is such a huge step up from the original game, and there's usually enough of each of those unique missions for you to get your fix. I do feel the game's story runs a bit too long, especially when you include the DLC sequences. Some sections also don't feel very fun to do, like the flying mission or the escorting of prisoners that happens a couple of times in Venice. Florence and Venice are well-designed areas, but the Tuscany and Forlì areas feel drab. I also have never cared for some of the artistic choices of the game, like the washed-out color palette of Forlì, or some of the character models' faces. Regardless, this game still represents the point where the series found its groove and remains for many fans the pinnacle of the series. At this point in the list, the games are pretty equal to me, and the only difference is how much fun I have with each of them. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is an anomaly amongst the series. It features a lot of the same gameplay systems as Origins. The story is really long, and a lot of the landscape isn't filled with meaningful content. It also focuses quite a bit on Greek mythology, which I didn't particularly care for when Valhalla did it with the Norse. I also feel like the faction system is pretty pointless, and yet I can't get enough of this game. The only thing I can really determine is that I have a lot of fun whenever I turn on the game. The opening musical theme is powerful and gets my blood pumping every time. In fact, this might be my favorite overall score of the series. I always play as Cassandra over Alexios, and she is the most likable lead that we've had since Ezio. The landscape is beautiful and contains such a variety of locations that I never feel like one type of location is dominating over the others. I love the mission structure and how clear it is that you are doing a central story mission or a major side mission or individual stories or quests. I'm not sure how this particular combination came together in such a way to appeal to me, but oh boy, it does. I don't want to undersell the problems that I listed earlier with this game because they are real flaws. The length of story means that it sometimes gets pretty tedious. The gameplay, while improved, does feel a lot like Origins 1.5 and doesn't get rid of several lingering problems, like targeting enemies. The Greek myth stuff feels like it takes away from the focus of the family and the sense of purpose that Cassandra is looking for. However, these feel like blemishes on a strong work of art. I realize I might be alone in this. Odyssey is a polarizing game for fans, but it feels like Ubisoft made a game in the style of Assassin's Creed Origins that's more tailored for me. If you ever needed proof of my feelings, My internal chronometer on my Xbox says that I've spent over 250 hours on this game. I think I need to go to Assassin's Creed Anonymous. This is the weakest story of the Ezio trilogy, but mechanically, it's the strongest of the 3 games. I love that every side activity has some sort of context for how it helps your effort to retake Rome. I also think this is the smoothest experience in pacing of the trilogy. It never takes too long to get to the fun stuff. Almost everything from AC2 has received some kind of enhancement or tweak, and I love some of the new mission types, such as the Leonardo da Vinci missions and the assassin recruitment system. The full synchronization requirements are a great idea for the most part, though some of the requirements got a little too out of hand, like the tank mission, or the multiplayer aspect was unneeded, but it offered a fun and unique alternative to the shooters that were prevalent at this time. In a lot of ways, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood represents classic Assassin's Creed at its very best. Yeah, you knew this game was going to be pretty high on the list, didn't ya? As much fun as I have with Odyssey and Brotherhood, this is the one that makes me smile the most whenever I think about it. One of the biggest criticisms lobbed at this game is how it isn't really an Assassin's Creed game. I do understand where that criticism comes from, but I also want to submit that this is a better Assassin's Creed experience than it gets credit for. The story is about finding a purpose in your life that is far bigger than personal ambitions. That is an excellent idea for a pirate story, and serves as a wonderful explanation as to why the Assassin Brotherhood has attracted so many of the other protagonists. Edward Kenway is a likable and sympathetic protagonist, and while he has a questionable morality, you're never confused as to why he's pursuing the actions that he does, which I wondered about with some of the other protagonists. His central goal always seems very clear to me, and that's quite a feat given that he plays off both factions to his advantage. Some of the side characters are also stand out in their roles. Blackbeard, Charles Vane, and Calico Jack are all some of my favorites. The music also is really great, especially the sea shanties. The world opens up surprisingly quickly, without placing unnecessary restrictions on the player. But honestly, most of the praise this game gets goes to the seafaring, and rightly so. Replace the soundtrack with the Pirates of the Caribbean score, which I've done, and it feels like the epitome of pirate offerings in video games. I love that the game allows you to engage in either sword combat to loot ships, or to just sink the ship. There's also something so relaxing about sailing with your crew. The atmospheric visuals, the sea shanties, and the visuals and the simplicity of the controls. It makes sailing one of the best things to come out of the series, and possibly video games at the time. Various other games included the seafaring as well, but there was always something that held it back. Like how Assassin's Creed 3 always kept it pretty linear in design. Rogue's Arctic setting wasn't quite as appealing as the Caribbean. Assassin's Creed Odyssey making it just a part of exploration and nothing more. Everything comes together in this game to make such a fun experience that will stick with players long after they see the credits roll. The Assassin's Creed franchise has become one of the most influential in modern video games, and it's amazing to think that we have been with the series for 15 years at this point. The series has its peaks and valleys for everyone, and this list is just where I stand with the series. This September, we're supposed to be getting a showcase for the series. I imagine it'll be a celebration of the series, though I'm also hoping that we will get some sort of an idea as to where the series might be going next, if not an official announcement to the follow-up to Valhalla. If you were looking for a great adventure set in a fascinating historical period with lots of twists, turns, and fun gameplay, heed the Creed.
Oh, all the comrades that e'er I had, they're sorry for my going away, and all the sweethearts that ere I've loved, they'd wished me one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you